Hello again, and welcome to Painless Universal, a conversation with myself and Welsh. Today's conversation, we'll be talking about liver chronic illness pain. We'll be talking to Dan. Dan is dealing with an invisible illness, type 1 diabetes. He was diagnosed at a very early stage in his life. He's never let this stop or build barriers for him, but he's used his difficulties, his challenges that he's faced with living with diabetes to find joy along the way. But living with diabetes type 1 has never been easy, especially for him. Through living with diabetes, he's struggled, he's had his own challenges, but he's found ways to deal with this. I'll be asking him how he's dealing with self-isolation, what are his steps to share with others who are not just suffering from diabetes type 1 or type 2, but other chronic illnesses, to understand how are they dealing with this. I'll also be talking to him about his kidney transplant, why he needed a kidney transplant, and how he overcame that. And also the difficult question about ethnic minorities not denoting. How did he find a suitable donor for his kidney transplant? Dan is here. Meet Dan. Hi everyone, and welcome to Painless Universal Conversation with myself and Welsh. I am super excited to have Dan with me to talk about his chronic illness struggle, diabetes type 1. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really, really good. I started working out again, so it's a little bit of a challenge for me. But I said with the second wave coming, I better keep myself fit
Yes,
and
yeah,
being able to fight and get my immune system back up.
yeah.
So I'm well. And Dan, I was really excited to talk to you, and the reason I'm not just because of everything you've overcome, but also who you are. You're such a fascinating person. You do so much, and you never let barriers get to you or stand in your way. Could you just tell us a little bit about who is Dan?
Um, so I guess probably starting on, I'll lead it to the medical stuff, but where you said about I don't let stuff get in my way, I think that comes from partly growing up and being told, you've got to, you can't let anything stop you. If somebody tells you you can't do something, you go and prove them wrong. That was kind of what was spoken about in my family, and it's also something that I've just developed within myself over time. If people doubt me, that kind of spurs me to kind of keep going. When it comes to health wise, so I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 10 years old. Um, and so I've been living with type 1 for just over 24 years. So you can work out how old I am based on based on that. And I think being diagnosed with a chronic illness at such a young age definitely had its challenges, particularly during my teenage years. Those were the difficult years for me, accepting the chronic illness, as well as just being a teenager and trying to fit in. Um, so that came with its big. That came with a lot of challenges, particularly there's something called diabetes distress and diabetes burnout, which are I'll definitely say more emotional and is more on the emotional and mental side of living with type 1 diabetes. And when I got to my, I'd say, early mid 20s, that's when I started to make a conscious change in terms of how I looked after myself when it came to living with type 1 diabetes. But with the condition, obviously, you have to manage it. And actually, just in case people don't know what type 1 diabetes is, I should probably just explain.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. So, what an autoimmune condition is where your body attacks its immune system. So, my pancreas cannot produce, my body attacked the beta cells in my pancreas. So, my body cannot produce insulin. So, when, for argument's sake, if I was going to eat a bowl of cereal, for me, for if this was somebody who had a fully functioning pancreas, they could eat the cereal, and the pancreas would release insulin and manage to break down the food, and the body would function normally. Whereas my body doesn't do that. So if I eat cereal,
Mm.
I have to give myself insulin injection. And what that does is that when the body's breaking down the food into glucose, etc., the insulin works as if I did have it, my body was producing insulin. So it prevents my, in theory, it prevents my glucose level going too high, um, because the insulin that I give should match the what's happening in terms of the carbohydrate intake that I'm taking with the food.
That's
That's in theory.
wow.
On paper, it's on paper it works very easy. In reality, it's very different. So yeah, that's, should have started there with what type 1 diabetes actually is. And um and so but you're not just doing this once a day, you're having to do this 3, 4, 5 times a day potentially when it comes to eating. And it really is much more than a physical condition. On paper it's physical, but it's mental, and emotional as well. And I think those were the biggest challenges for me during the teenage years and into kind of the early 20s. But as I said, I've managed to turn that around, and I'm in a much better place now, although I'm living with complications from not managing my type 1 as well as I could have in the past. And I think probably touch on that a bit later about how important self-talk has been, and learning to forgive myself for what has happened in the past and where I find myself now. And that's kind of me as a person. Yeah, I'm I'm very driven. I think that type one's taught me a lot in terms of accountability. And what I'm really wanting to do now is kind of give, is not kind of, is to give back to the diabetes community, and to spread awareness of type 1 diabetes, and really do what I can now that I'm in a position where I've learned so much over the years of living with type 1.
No, no, this is truly amazing. And now, because when we live with chronic illness, especially when you're diagnosed with with chronic illness at a young age, it's absolutely difficult. And I relate to you by saying that it is actually worse in your teenage years because you want to do what everyone else is doing. You
Mm.
want to eat, you want to drink, you want to do what everyone else is doing, and you forget that vital thing that yeah, you can do what everyone else is doing. It's just that you have to be a little bit cautious. I'm looking at myself now in my 40s, and I'm just learning to swim because I was not allowed to swim when I was much younger because when I was younger, I would be so sick, but I just didn't realize I shouldn't be sick. It's just the way I went swimming. I didn't do it the right way. But in your instance, you learned that you had diabetes and was diagnosed with diabetes at 10. How was that? How did that come about? Was that something? Could you? I don't know if you remember specifically because for mine. I was born with mine, and it was and my mom noticed that the symptoms at 6 months old. So at 10, here's this young boy, running around doing everything everyone else is doing. Because I worry about that because you just touched on something very sensitive for me because my son is like he's just turned 11. So I'm just worried all of a sudden someone just says they have this long-term condition. How did you take it and how did you cope with it being so young? And
So when I was, so typically the signs for being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they're like, they call them the 40s. So it's about being thirsty. Um, so are you drinking a lot? So thinner? Are you losing weight? Um, are you and then it's all linked to being like tired. And for the life of me, the other T has completely just gone out of my head. But there are typical symptoms that you find when you are somebody is developing type 1 diabetes. So at that time it was during the summer holidays, so it was in August, and I was drinking a lot. But because it was really warm outside, my family didn't really think anything of it. And you wouldn't, because it's hot, and you're just he's just drinking, and that's fine because it's hot. And what happened over the, I'd say it happened over a day where my aunt took me and my cousins to the cinema. I was unwell, came home. My mum called the emergency GP, um, said you need to take him to accident and emergency now, because he tested my glucose levels. And so, just to explain a bit more about glucose levels, typically
Mm,
somebody who doesn't have type 1 diabetes, your glucose levels tend to be between 4 and 6 millimoles. Um, and so that's obviously where your body's functioning, and the insulin's being produced to match the carbohydrates that are coming in. You do sometimes get a spike if you live with type 1 diabetes where your glucose levels goes out of that range, but typically you're usually in that range. Whereas somebody with type 1, because your body isn't producing the insulin and you have to manually do it, and this is even before diagnosis, your glucose levels aren't between 4 and 6. They
mm,
can go up to to to
mm,
high numbers, and the higher the number it gets to, then the worse that is for the individual who's got type 1 diabetes, because then what can happen is you can go into it's called diabetic ketoacidosis. So that's where you've got too much glucose in your blood, and what happens then is that that can lead to you going into a coma. So it's a very, very serious condition.
mm,
And um, and so my glucose levels was they were way they were out of range. Very fortunately, I didn't go into a coma, so I was very fortunate in terms of that with diagnosis. And what I really remember from that is the doctor telling me that I had diabetes. I remember that very clearly, being in the kind of the pediatric accident and emergency department, and then being in hospital for, I think it was a week or two. Um, and one thing about me is that I'm an Arsenal fan, and at the time they kept telling me about Gary Mabbott, who's got type 1 diabetes, but he's the captain of Spurs. So for those who don't know, Arsenal and Spurs are rivals.
mm,
And I was 10 years old, and I was like, why do you keep telling me about a Spurs player who's got type 1? It doesn't make sense to me. He doesn't play for Arsenal. And that's kind of what I really remember from the diagnosis. And obviously older now, you realize why, but at that time it was just like, I know you're trying to relate to me about football, but this isn't working. This isn't for me. He doesn't play for Arsenal. So yeah.
wow. No, oh gosh. So how did you manage it once you got diagnosed? How did you then manage and say, okay, this is something new. This is something if I don't take care of myself, did you have any classes or did you have any, did they get people to come educate your family to help you with the process?
So from what I can remember, obviously remember before going home, having to have my first injection at hospital, and that was painful. I didn't like needles. I'm still not keen on needles to this day, which many people might find weird because I'm dealing with needles quite a lot now. And so I remember that. In terms of education, that was probably more linked to my mum, um, and there wasn't really a structured class, but there were diabetic nurses, and they were called home care nurses who would come and visit, but there was no clear structured education, and that kind of was how it was set up and has been set up for me anyway for a number of years. Is that when it came to education, there was no clear structured education around how to manage type 1. Obviously, you'd go to your appointments and you could talk to your healthcare professionals.
Mm,
Um, I have had, about 6 years ago, structured education around carbohydrate counting, which is what you need to do before you can use an insulin pump, which is a way of delivering insulin which is another way of delivering insulin, and not using injections, or not having to take injections. So that's really the kind of only structured education I've had. Um, but it's probably very different now for
mm,
people who are if you're a child diagnosed. And I think that culturally as well. So my family's from the Caribbean, and when it came to health, we didn't really talk about health or really look at trying to understand more about health conditions. So there was never really the push there from my there was never really the push there from my family to do that as well. It's only as I've got older and found myself in different environments that I've learned more going off my own back to increase my knowledge.
For those of us that don't know, Dan, one of the key thing I want to ask is that a child being born, can they be diagnosed at early stage with diabetes, or is it something that just has to progressively take its form, or is it something you could screen for when a lady's when someone is pregnant? Is that something you know about?
So I can't answer in terms of
Mm,
screening. I would likely say you can't screen for type 1 diabetes, although, and I don't want to go too down, but obviously women can get gestational diabetes.
yeah,
And I don't know if there's any science between having gestational diabetes and
and the child.
child developing type 1. So I can't really answer
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
But in terms of being diagnosed with type 1, you can be diagnosed at any age. So in a podcast episode, I spoke to a dad whose son was diagnosed at 11 months old. So you can be diagnosed at, at, at any age with type 1.
Wow. Okay. So, what are the challenges? What are some of the pains once you, is it in terms of relationship, in terms of working? What are the typical challenges someone with type 1 diabetes tend to face in society?
I think for me, from my perspective, I think they're quite. So I think one of them is the misconception around type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, but also there are other types of diabetes as well. Um, but the two that we tend to hear about are type 1 diabetes and type 2.
Mm,
And I think those misconceptions that are out there in society affect both people living with type 1 and type 2. So it's about, you often hear, oh, if I eat sugar, I'm going to get diabetes. And in fact, that's not the case. But that's a misconception that you have. And there's when people use the word diabetes and not differentiating about what type they're talking about, again, that's something that you're having to challenge, because for people where I've said that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition, it's a lifelong condition. It can't be um, reversed, or once you have it, you have it, and you have to manage it by taking insulin injections. Whereas with type 2 diabetes, there's obviously there's work that you can do where you can stop developing type 2 diabetes. Whereas with type 1, it's different. But again, both conditions, both types have their own challenges. So I think from a societal point of view, definitely that if you look into the workplace, I think that feeds in from wider society. So actually understanding
mm,
what type 1 diabetes is and challenging the misconceptions that people might have. And as somebody living with type 1, you know that, and I've spoken to friends about this, that who live with type 1, that you feel that you have to almost prove that type 1 isn't a weakness, because some people can take it as a weakness, as, oh, say I can't do a particular task, maybe I can't do it because I can't do it, not because I have type 1.
mm,
And whereas people might, I'm just for argument's sake, your manager might link that to, oh, Daniel's got type 1, that's why he can't do it. And
mm,
then before you know it, you're in a position where your type 1 is being used against you. So I
mm.
think that's a challenge in particularly in the workplace, that people have to overcome. Um, so have I? What was the
Yeah.
other
No,
part to?
no, 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 you really answered it. No, it's also relationship. I was asking about how do one deal with relationship with type 1, especially with eating habits, because there's certain things
Yes.
you tend to manage what you eat, and someone else might say, okay, I want to eat this. How do you deal with such an issue like that?
So when it comes to eating, I think that if I'm really honest, I think the way that type 1 is the condition itself is set up, it can be, and I don't want to almost like I'm going to say breeding ground, but it can set up the parameters for somebody to develop either disordered eating or an eating disorder, because you're so conscious of the food that you're consuming and the amount that you're consuming that it can distort the relationship with your relationship with food. So perhaps you um for example, so if I were to take too much insulin, my blood sugar would fall low, and that would be, as I mentioned earlier, there's like between four, it would drop lower than four. So I would need to treat that low blood sugar with glucose. But I might have just had dinner. I'm not hungry, but now I need to treat that low blood sugar. Otherwise, if it drops too low, then again, I can fall into a coma.
Mm.
So I'm now having to eat more food, even though I don't want to eat, or I could drink, but maybe I don't want to do either. But I have to do that because I have to stay alive. And I think so again, it distorts that relationship with you. Can't, you can eat what you want within reason,
Mm.
because obviously you can manage it by taking insulin. But at the same time, you have to be conscious of what and when you're eating. And so again, that distorts the relationship with food.
Yeah.
And kind of, as I've touched on, so if I'm at, for argument's sake, a family party and there's just rice being piled up on my plate, and it's like eat this, eat that, and it's very carb heavy, but I don't know how many carbohydrates are in those two big spoons of rice on my plate and whatever, then I'm having to think, oh, how many carbohydrates could this be?
Wow.
And so there's these with type 1 diabetes, anyone living with type 1 diabetes, even if you're a parent of a child with type 1 diabetes, your mind is always going. It's
Mm.
like the second hand on a clock. It's just always ticking, you're always working, always thinking, oh, what's going on, what's going on. So yeah, your relationship with food isn't, you can eat, you can enjoy food, but you enjoy food and it has a caveat with it.
Yeah. With COVID-19, and now we're talking about second waves. One of the
Yeah.
this downside for people with chronic illness is that our immune system it's never, never in the right place to take care of us just in case. Self-isolation is something that's, I don't know, people with diabetes, people with any kind of chronic illness has been sent letters to saying they might have to self-isolate, especially during the first wave. How does self-isolation affect people's work when they have a chronic illness?
So do you mean if somebody's working from
Yeah,
home or managing the condition, or
uh, you know, work in terms of you have to go for your job. Some people with type 1 diabetes still have to work, even if it's
yeah.
because some job are not all job are online. Some job you have to physically go there. So how would someone who's self-isolated, what would you advise that person to do to keep well when there's a coronavirus around? For
That's
yourself
it.
as well.
That's a difficult one. So for myself, I'm very fortunate that I can work from home. So I've been working from home since March, and I have very understanding employers. So that's a good thing for me to be in that position. If you, I, it's a difficult one.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not sure I'm well positioned to give advice to say if I was working in
In the
like in retail or somewhere where the shops were open. I would like to think that the organizations and the managers would understand how serious type 1 diabetes is, and in terms of the condition, and would work with the person living with type 1 diabetes to ensure that they're safe. Because under so I work in HR, so under the Equality Act, they do have a duty of care to their employer, their employee, because type 1 diabetes is a protected characteristic. So I would like to think that employers would work with somebody living with type 1 diabetes.
That's true. Has it been what are some of the challenges you said in your teen was difficult because obviously you wanted to live, and that has caused you challenges along now that you're much older. What are some of those challenges that you could share with us that you've had to face because of the way you've managed or not managed your diabetes over the years?
Yeah, not definitely not managed at the time. So in 2013, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, which was most likely a complication of type 1 diabetes. And so the complications developed when your glucose levels, as I mentioned earlier, are above the levels that they need to be, and they're consistently above those levels. And what that means is the excess glucose is doing damage to your body over a period of time.
Mhm.
And so being diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, and that led to me having a kidney transplant in April 2018. So it was like 5 years of managing chronic kidney disease, and gradually over time, your my kidney function was declining, and I was very very fortunate to have a transplant from a live donor. So I didn't need dialysis, and I'm very fortunate to be in that position, to have been in that position. Um, so that was the challenge with the kidney disease, but that was also helpful for me because during that journey, I realized that actually other people get ill and other people can develop kidney
Mm,
issues and need kidney transplants. Whereas at that time, because I was living with type 1, for me, it was always if somebody has kidney problems, it's linked to type 1 diabetes or it's linked to diabetes. And when I was in clinics or joining or on like Facebook groups, I realized actually there are other people who don't have type 1 or diabetes who need kidney transplants. And that was really helpful for me in terms of letting go of what's happened in the past and being where I am now. But also, I know that I take accountability for what has happened in the past as well, but know that I can't change it. And also, another complication of diabetes that I live with is diabetic retinopathy. So that's in the back of my eyes. There are blood vessels growing, and so what again that's linked to the control that I didn't have um, over the previous years. And so with that, these blood vessels can grow, and then obviously they're growing in places where they shouldn't be growing. So I've
mm,
had to have laser surgery to remove these blood vessels. And also I've had it's called vitrectomy surgery. So with one of them, I had a hemorrhage in an eye, so they had to take out the gel and remove the hemorrhage in the eye. And again, that's because of the previous management, but also with retinopathy, due to the length of time that I've lived with type 1, it could be that as well. So it's also the length of time that you've lived with type 1 can have an impact on the complications that you have. So it's twofold. I think particularly in my case, it's linked to past management, and I think that's it. But my
mm.
past management could have been fine, and I could still develop complications. But a lot of what going through these complications, the physical, the mental and emotional toll that it's taken on me, and actually developing the thought process and thinking through, well, why am I here? What has happened? And learning to accept that has helped me to be where I am today, in a position to be able to talk about the conditions that what I'm going through, and share my experiences to
Mm.
hopefully help others who are in the same position as me. Um, but yeah, it's not been an easy, straightforward journey, but it's an ongoing journey. And so yeah, I'm kind of here now.
I'm so glad that at least you found your ways to deal with the challenges, because I think what you're saying is that, if people, the younger ones out there going through similar thing, type 1 diabetes, even type 2, whatever chronic illness, if they take that time out to really look after themselves, listen to their body, that will reduce further on complication, especially being especially this October is Black History Month. Was it
Mm.
hard getting a donor match for your kidney? when you had to do the transplant? Were you just lucky?
So my donor was a family member, so I was fortunate in that sense. But I think that with organ donation, it comes with its own challenges because you're not asking somebody to lend you £20. You're asking somebody who's well to have an operation to give you an organ that will help you. And with that comes, there's also a sense of guilt there as well that, oh, I'm having to ask. So I didn't really approach the conversation
Mm,
as soon as I should have because of how I felt about it. And it's an awkward conversation to have because, as I said, it's not like, asking for money and saying, oh, I'm going to pay you back, and you can't say, oh, I'll give it back to you, or anything like that. So it wasn't straightforward, but I was very fortunate to be in a position where I had a live donor. But
mm,
had I not been, then I would be on the transplant waiting list. And as I'm sure many people have, if heard or if they haven't heard, that when it comes to Black, Asian, and people from ethnic backgrounds, but particularly Black backgrounds, being organ donors, the numbers on the register are quite low. And I know the law has changed recently about around organ donation, but
mm.
still, the numbers are still relatively low.
I listened to one of your podcasts, Talking Type 1.
Yeah.
And, and I was very fascinated. My final question is just if you really, you really ask and talk about very, very, very important details about diabetes, everything, all things. It's almost like it should be called All Things Diabetes. Why did you start it, and how do you use that platform to help people find their joy?
So, so for me, I started it because I I was a guest on another podcast, and I really enjoyed that experience. And then I also, so I enjoyed that experience. I also, as I mentioned, I work in HR, so I'm used to kind of being in interviews and speaking to people. So I like that aspect of it. And also, I just wanted to give something back to the community because I noticed that there are some voices that aren't heard, or there are some stories that aren't heard, but actually everyone's story, everyone's journey is so unique to them that
Mm,
they just needed to, I just wanted to have a platform where people could share those stories. And it's about helping others, and it's always been for me just at least helping one other person. So I try to speak um, to a wide variety of people. Obviously, I've got people who I interact with on Instagram, but also through work, working at a diabetes charity, that there's access there to a wealth of knowledge and information, and trying to bring those two worlds together. But also, diabetes, type 1 diabetes, is like the condition itself, the fundamentals are universal. So
mm,
it's all about sharing stories from across the world as well. But each one of it, each one of us have our own challenges. So if I'm speaking to somebody in America, their challenge could be having access to insulin. But another person who I'm speaking to in America might have the insurance that covers that access. Or if I speak to um, somebody in India, again, it could be access to insulin and being able to looking at access to technology. And so, as I said, the fundamentals are the same, but the challenges that we all face are different. And it's about giving people a voice to share their stories and help others, because we're all going through the same thing. And I know that when I've been at particular points, particularly around complications, that I felt alone. And I
mm,
don't want anyone to ever feel alone and
mm,
feel like there isn't somebody who hasn't gone through what you're going through or even experienced anything like that. So yeah, that's kind of why I created it. And it's been really rewarding. And I know it might sound a bit cliche, but it's an honor that people feel comfortable to allow me to share their journeys. And it's
mm.
a responsibility that I take very seriously.
Well, Dan, absolutely. I'm so glad you shared your story with myself. because these are critical issues that people, the more we talk about it, the more people better understand and also aware. I know about diabetes type 1 and type 2, but I didn't realize the seriousness or how to even manage it. But you shed massive light on it for other people, not just myself. I really applaud you and thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me. Thank you.
That's all right. And thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. Thank you.